Classic mode is finally here! Co-op raids, custom abyss, Manekina cart, Kenichi parkour. So many new possibilities are now open to us. One can only wonder what wonderful games await us in this brand new... In this video, we will discuss the differences between Beyond and Classic mode, what should make it appealing to you as a developer, as well as the secret to making this new, long-awaited Miliastra mode far more interesting than you might initially realize. The very first difference appears before you even deploy a singular entity or terrain, as when creating a new Wonderland, the editor will prompt you with a very important question: Beyond mode or Classic mode? And as we will see shortly, this is a very important question that you may have already answered yourself before clicking this video, but depending on what type of Wonderland you wish to create, you might want to give it some more thought. As it says on the prompt, the mode you choose cannot be modified once chosen, and there are several features exclusive to either mode, as displayed in the official Craftsperson Academy page. With that out of the way, let me present to you GENSHIN PVP ABYSS. Down to its core, it's a simple Wonderland. You load in, you do the stage setup, you choose from a selection of little helpers, recharge a Manekin burst manually if you're so inclined, and once everything is good, you walk into the platform to ready up and start the game. Once the game starts, you interact with the center object to spawn the randomized enemies. These enemies have been curated to avoid bad matchups, and their resistances have been normalized across the board to prevent certain teams from being randomly given an advantage or disadvantage. Once you defeat them all, a teleporter to the next segment shows up. While in a challenge, pickupable buffs will spawn periodically with very small benefits. Rinse and repeat 2 more times, and you'll reach the end boss. As of now, there are 2 separate bosses you can encounter here, but I plan to add more via custom creations, another new addition from Luna 4. After defeating the boss, the end of run platform spawns in, and you can choose to either settle the stage, replay with the same enemy formation, or re-randomize the enemy formation. At a first glance, this does seem to be a very simple combat simulator, but as the name implies, the main focus of this Wonderland is in PvP, in this case, an enemy clearing race. You may have noticed in the footage from earlier that there was another lane in the other side of the stage that we never visited. That's because when the stage is played in multiplayer, 3 massive new features reveal themselves: the center customization tab, the racing mechanics, and a brand new mechanic for the final boss. With the tab, you can choose to run the game in PvP or co-op mode, with the latter making both players teleport to the same lane, and the game playing more or less the same as if it were in solo. This sounds like a small feature, but it is secretly massive. It allows for players to enjoy the Wonderland in yet another way, as many players have wished in the past to be able to play co-op in difficult endgame content. This makes my Wonderland appeal to more players than just those looking for competitive custom combat content. The real meat and potatoes of this Wonderland is the PvP mode. With it enabled, each player is sent to their own lane at the start of the game, and the Wonderland actually spawns the exact same enemy formation on both lanes. Each lane also keeps their own individualized count for enemies being defeated, such that the lanes can't interfere with each other, and the field buffs spawn in the exact same locations as well. You also may have noticed these navigation icons that pop up for the center object and the teleporter for the next room. These come with boolean filters that, in PvP mode, prevent player 2 from being able to see the icons from player 1 and vice versa. The checkpoint teleporter, however, is shared by both players, so instead of having a single navigation icon, it has 2, and as each player finishes their side of the lane, their respective boolean filters are applied, making one of them visible to the player who cleared while preventing the other player from seeing it to avoid confusion. When reaching the end of run boss, there are now 2 bars to the side of the screen that track how much damage each player does to the boss. The player who deals the most damage gets a time reduction to their final score, as does the player who manages to deal the last blow to the boss. These are the deciding factors when a race is otherwise very close. And that's the summary of GENSHIN PVP ABYSS. As you can see, even a simple combat Wonderland has a lot of considerations to keep in mind if it wants to be a host to a varied type of gameplay modes, even if what players end up doing in it is essentially Genshin's combat. Now, how does one go about setting something like this up? Let's start from the top with the stage settings. The start of it is the same as Beyond mode, the scene length and environmental level being intact. The first difference comes in the number of permitted players, which for Classic mode is capped at 4. This is because it follows standard Genshin co-op rules, as we can also see in the number of principal cast members setting, which is their way of saying how many characters we have in our party, where even setting it to 2 players or 4 players does not allow us to grant more characters than usual, and if there's ever more than 2 players, it caps us at 1 character per player, not allowing the host to have 2 characters, as is the case when there's 3 players in regular Genshin co-op. Here's also where we see one of the most interesting features of Classic mode, which is character restrictions. By default, there are no restrictions, but if you wanted to, for example, ban center shielders from entering your PvP Wonderland, or simply trim the list down to only characters with mobility options for a racing Wonderland, here's where you would do that. Some things to keep in mind here. If you do not own any suitable characters for the Wonderland, Miliastra will simply not let you into the Wonderland. As of now, there is no way to grant trials of these characters, so make sure to not make your Wonderland too restrictive and allow at least the free to obtain options to be able to enter. Stage entity and time work the exact same, but here we have another difference in load optimizations. Normally, there will be a setting here asking if each object should follow their own setting or if there's a global rule for optimization. These options are now gone for the reason that I assume is that it now follows your own Genshin Impact draw distance configuration. As we head into factions, there's another big change. The factions in Classic are set and cannot be changed or altered mid-execution. We also can't add or remove any new factions. Players and creations are always of the respective faction, and only objects can be set up to be of any faction. Because of this, a very common mistake in Classic comes from how you set up your object factions. We can see right here that the default object faction is hostile towards players. This causes several issues with the auto-targeting of character skills and summon behavior. If we look at Object Faction 3 instead, it is friendly towards players. Every time you create objects for your Wonderland, which is a lot of the time for most Wonderlands, remember to change their faction settings to 3, and also turn on Can't Be Targeted option under battle settings, as some abilities still target objects even when they're friendly. Spawn points and revival point settings are the exact same, no changes here. And player count is also the same, with the caveat that it can only have 4 players maximum. Loading screen, settlement, and nav mesh options are all the same as well. Now, let's take a look at the stage entity. There are no differences here from Beyond to Classic. The stage entity needs to have almost all of the information that will be presented to the UI as custom variables, so one has to keep that in mind when developing Node for the Wonderland. As you can see, it already has quite a lot of variables set up, although some of these could be optimized to not need 2 variables for displaying the information. The custom variable limit per single entity is 500, so I'm far from reaching it, but optimization should always be a consideration when developing. Node mounting stays the same between Beyond and Classic, but the 10 node graph limits per entity can get in the way really fast when talking about the stage entity. I also named the nodes a bit differently here so I can easily search for them when mounting. With that done, let's look at the player and character entities. And here's where we'll see some major differences once more. Class options have been removed, and with them the default camera options as well. These features are exclusive to Beyond mode as of now. The player is also responsible for owning several variables, including those that go to their UI on a specific basis, as opposed to the stage entity, which usually holds more general UI information. The node mounting for player is still the same, so we now move to character. And here's yet another classic distinction. Can you see it? We do not have access to sound toggle, battle settings, and most importantly, node graph mounting. Now this might be the single biggest difference for Classic. It goes even beyond that, as if we go to the unit status screen, we'll also see that several of the unit status that work perfectly fine on characters in Beyond mode now state that they do not work for characters anymore, only affecting creations and objects. So, what gives? Are we really unable to use any of these features for Classic? Well, what if I told you there's a secret to making them work? Something that you'd only know if your previous Miliastra game development was spent like 90% of the time messing around with said feature? We'll get back to that in a sec. Moving on, as mentioned previously, certain unit statuses were altered to not work with characters in Classic anymore, and some of these really are impossible to add to characters, such as interrupt intake modifications. Over on the topic of interruption resistance, we also cannot generate any shields for characters or manage their stacking logic in Classic. They all work as they do in Genshin normally. This segues into skills, which are now exclusively used for custom creation skills. This is the new Luna 4 feature that can really spice up a game using it, but we won't be covering them in this video. The takeaway here is that, at the moment, we cannot design new skills for the existing Genshin characters, like we can for the Manekin in Beyond mode. Not normally, that is. Same for local projectiles. In Classic, they're used exclusively for the new custom creations. Now, before we move on to the next category, let's have a quick recap. We saw that, unlike in Beyond mode, in Classic, we lose access to a handful of unit statuses, mainly handling certain character stats. We can't mount nodes on characters directly, and that we can't design new skills for the characters. But, what if I told you that we can solve all of these limitations with our next item on the list? And coincidentally, the next item we're gonna look at is items. This is the secret knowledge that I'm imparting to you. In Classic mode, items are going to be the lifeblood of your game. In particular, items of the equipment type specifically. One of the big things that I wanted to solve for my multiplayer-centric Classic Wonderland was the fact that when playing co-op in Genshin Impact, you would often find yourself not being able to do much with your character. A lot of the time, you press their skill, their burst, and your next best course of action would be to spam normal attacks that may or may not even be leveled. And so, I went on a Classic quest to find a way to add custom skills back into the editor. My first idea was to look at the UI elements, as I could easily query if a UI element was pressed and perform additional logic as needed. In the regular UI, under default keybinds, we have the G and the Z keys available as button presses, as well as the T key for the Sumeru and Inazuma style grapple points. These can't be changed, so it wasn't sufficient for me. It may be sufficient for your use case, and you can easily add functionality to those via these nodes, but I wanted a better implementation for that. That's when I turned to custom UI buttons. Those come in two varieties, item buttons and equipment buttons. Item buttons can be used to use your items while on the field, not needing to go to the inventory UI to manually use them. But items are always finite, and while I could create new functionality with these and add 9,999 of the item to the player inventory, the second option is simply a lot better. Equipment display. Not only are equipment not consumed when used by this feature, they're also the perfect vessel for solving the other two issues presented earlier. Either way, we can set our config ID and cooldown via player custom variable, and designate one of several different keybinds to them, while also having it be hidden if the item is not present in the player's inventory. With this knowledge in mind, we can set up our items to add extra functionality to Classic mode that behaves very similarly to instance skills from Beyond. We make sure to create them as equipment, set up their appearances and name, and then complete their configuration in the Settings tab. One thing to keep in mind with items is that while we can prevent players from destroying them, and we can set their loot configuration to save so that they're not lost when defeated, we can't prevent them from discarding them. Depending on your game, you can either set up a loot appearance so that players can grab the item back from the ground, auto pickup, or apply additional node that detects when items are lost from the inventory to add another copy of them. Once the equip item is configured and we add the item config ID and cooldown custom variables to the player, add an inventory to our character, and then we add the UI button, set up the variables from the player themselves, and add a suitable keybind and position to it. After that, we can create our node. Using when UI control group is triggered event node, we can check for the player item config ID variable, see if it matches the item config ID of the equipment we created. If it does, it means the player is attempting to use that specific item. So we can perform additional logic from there, such as spawning a projectile prefab, new attack hitboxes, or an entirely new entity with its own logic and preset behavior. The way you can handle the logic for item tracking in your Wonderland can vary a lot, but for this Wonderland, I use tabs. These tabs here add the specific item to the character and simultaneously set the item config ID to the corresponding value as well as cooldown. Since I added 2 custom skills to my Wonderland, I also have to check if these values are empty first so that the player can obtain 2 items and corresponding information. You can polish this implementation by adding a logic that keeps track of the order that each item was obtained, such that when the player tries to obtain a 3rd item, it automatically replaces the oldest item in their inventory. But wait, there's a catch. If you apply this setup to your Wonderland, you will come to realize that once you swap characters, your equipment display is now gone. What gives? Well, remember how items in inventory are character-related features? In Classic mode, each player has several characters. This means that each character has their own inventory that you must manage via node. This is currently a common mistake among many Classic Wonderlands. When purchasing items, they will only consume currency, the character buying it, and will only be added to that character's inventory. You can circumvent this by running a list iteration loop of all characters owned by the player, which you can get by identifying which character is currently using the tab or the shop. Another way to do this would be, in case you wanted to set up each ability to be attributed to each character inherently, you can, on creation, run a list iteration loop of all characters and check the instanced value for each of their Classic mode ID. Then run this through a multiple branches chain to identify which character it is and give them the specific item or items to grant them their particular new equipment-based skills. But wait, you might be thinking, if items are largely character-based features, and I can't mount nodes directly on characters, how am I going to query when they're added or lost from inventory and run other character-related logic? Well, that is a good question to ask, because you've already answered it yourself. It's via items, of course. Introducing item node graphs. These are node graphs that run on the item itself, and the item belongs to a character. As far as Miliastra Sandbox is concerned, any node mounted on an item that you own behaves more or less exactly as a node mounted on the character itself. This means that with items, we've reclaimed the basic functionality of character nodes for ourselves in Classic mode, and this alone has huge implications. It, more immediately, does mean that we can now receive when item is added or lost from the inventory types of events. But even more importantly, we have access to everything else. This is a feature that my Wonderland currently uses to completely enhance and rework the functionality of the Manekin, my Wonderland. Since we've regained access to when attack hits nodes and many others, we can now query who is dealing said attack via the Classic Character ID check node. Using this, we can set up a whole host of new functionalities to that character, things such as adding unit statuses to the enemies that they hit, spawning completely new attacks, projectiles, and even having trigger conditions, quotas, timers, checking if they're on-field or off-field via get actor character. The options are quite literally endless. I've set up my Manekin to deliver random elemental blasts when they attack, and on every 3rd blast, they instead unleash a barrage of several random elements. Using this implementation, you could design completely new enhancements for your old characters. Just keep in mind that you cannot apply ability units to characters. So, for example, in my Wonderland, I have a character buffs handler entity which receives signals from the item node graph and unleashes initiate attack events according to the signal parameters on behalf of the characters. You also have to be extra careful about the trigger conditions of these items. Remember, each character has their inventory, so if they all have the same item, depending on the trigger condition, all 4 may end up triggering every time. Be very specific about under what conditions you want each of those item effects to trigger. Also, item node graphs are entirely separate from the entity node graphs, which are normally the majority of graphs that we use. Since they're different types, copying and pasting nodes back and forth when editing them is not possible. Make sure to create the relevant nodes on the relevant graph types to avoid having to manually redo them. Now, if you wanted to give your buffed characters a little numbers boost too while you're at it, since you want to see their old abilities doing good damage as well, this is where the distinction between item and equipment becomes completely evident. If we choose to work with equipment, we can simply manipulate the equipment affixes via node while they are added as well. And here's where we reclaim most of what we lost from certain unit statuses being unavailable in Classic. The equipment affix versions of these statuses are fair game. You can add stats such as crit rate, attack, HP, defense adjustments, all via affixes. Combining all that we've learned so far, we can, for example, have an equipment with an item node that checks for when a character's attack hits. When it does, check whose classic character ID that is, and if it matches, apply relevant logic. In this case, apply a flat buff of crit rate, damage, as well as attack percent to the Manekin equipment. And remember, since equipment is individualized per character, only Manekin gets buffed by these affixes, which are set to take effect simply by having the item. Also, when they deal elemental damage while on field, send a signal to the handler entity so it can initiate attack of a random element towards the enemy, regenerate a flat amount of energy, and also apply a unit status to the enemy that lowers all of their elemental resistance. Keeping count of the instances, on every third instance, it sends several signals to the handler entity, albeit with a weaker intensity for the attack. The randomness of the attacks combines well with the random outfit swaps. It makes them a truly unique kind of on-field driver, complementing their baseline Tevad kit perfectly. To add a little more utility, I also implemented additional logic that checks for character swaps. In the When Character Swaps event node is player-based, so this must be mounted on a player node or forwarded from a player node. Every 15 seconds, when the Manekin switches to off-field, they also spawn a lookalike version of their ultimate to give them some extra use from off-field while you set up your abilities again, and to make their ultimate swap damage instance more appealing. To understand which element this should be, I check which element the first of their elemental hits was, as unless someone is using something like Chongyan or Bennett's Constellation 6 to intentionally swap the element of the Manekin, should always be of their element. The entity I spawn through this method mounts the according VFX on themselves and calls the corresponding ability unit from among the selection when the on-hit condition is triggered, so I only need to use one prefab slot for this feature. I run similar logic to determine which of the Traveler buffs should be in effect, as whenever the Traveler attacks something with Pyro, they regain abilities similar to those they had when fighting against Gosoita, the Reaper of the Abyss. These are in place because characters such as the Traveler and the Manekins have the same character ID no matter which element they're set to. Of course, if one gets too specific and official about the implementations of these features, which is to say, trying to make them feel legit as something Hoyoverse themselves could do, as you can see, it can really take a while to be developed and becomes quite complicated. But it's genuinely impressive to see how much can be done with such a limited access to features in Classic mode, and that we could have so much more than that done when Classic receives new feature updates. As we were talking about combat, let's talk about another Classic quirk, which is character revival. It's somewhat limited at the moment, as revive the active character only works when the character is in the death animation while on field, and revive all player characters only works when all of that player's characters are down. You can cover for both cases, as you can have an item node graph with revival logic that queries whenever a character dies via damage or via node effect, reviving them if it's the former. The complication here is that if the character dies from off-field, which is possible on higher latency or via very rare effects, in this case, the character is not the active character anymore, so the only way to revive them is via revive all player characters, which requires all characters to be downed. The way you cover for that is by using the defeat all of players characters node to force the revive all of player characters node activation condition to be in effect, and then immediately revive them right back. You can also run logic right after the revival, such as increasing their elemental energy, making them invulnerable for a few seconds to allow the player to regain control. In my Wonderland, said functionality is tied to yet another interactable equip display. It's a bit awkward, but it's how it currently works. Before we finish this video, let us recap what we learned today. Beyond and Classic modes have their own exclusive features, the extensive list of which you can find in the official Craftsperson Academy document. Once chosen, the mode cannot be changed. Certain features are preset and can't be altered, but with a bit of creativity, you can get around even those. Even with these workarounds, however, some things are truly unavailable, such as camera control and shield management. But in exchange for that, you get the extremely powerful resource trove that is the Classic characters. And, with the equipment features discussed, you can grant them new skills and or edit their functionality even further beyond to never before seen levels. Keeping in mind the enemy lineups to avoid bad matchups, as well as the revival rules for Classic and enemy balancing, You can create truly unique and satisfying combat scenarios for players of any investment level to engage with. The tips and tricks explained here also work for other styles of Wonderlands, such as element-themed combat Wonderlands via the character resurgence feature, as well as racing and even parkour-style Wonderlands. By using the combined efforts of equipments and varying character classic ID nodes, you can apply a whole host of new functionalities to any character of your choosing to make for more interesting and balanced gameplay for these Wonderlands. Now that I've shown you the secret to making Classic mode fun, and how to reclaim a good chunk of the Beyond functionality, do you have any new ideas for Classic mode after watching this video? Share them with us in the comments below. And also, remember to join the official Creator Front Discord server so you can stay up to date with any new Classic developments, as well as to interact with several other creators of the same mind as you, receive tips from our mentors, get playtesters, translators, and so much more. I hope to see your Classic Wonderland up in Miliastra soon. This is Dark Stargazer, signing out. Take care.